Hello, welcome to Crimson Noir.
The village of Ashcombe on Wold prided itself on its preserves. Every summer, when the strawberries ripened and the blackberries thickened along the hedgerows, nearly every household produced jars of jam, marmalade and chutney. Recipes were exchanged, competitions were held, and old rivalries quietly resurfaced beneath smiling conversation. The annual harvest and preserves fair was one of the village's most beloved traditions. On a bright September afternoon, the village hall was crowded with residents eager to display their finest creations. Rows of gleaming glass jars lined long wooden tables: strawberry jam, blackcurrant preserve, gooseberry jelly, orange, marmalade, each carefully labeled, each prepared with pride. The centerpiece of the event was the Golden Spoon Award, presented every year to the maker of the finest preserve in Ashcombe on Wold. Winning it carried surprising prestige. For some villagers, perhaps a little too much prestige. Miss Marple happened to be visiting an auntie, old school friend in the village, and accepted an invitation to attend the fair. She spent much of the afternoon sitting quietly near the refreshment table, knitting and observing. People tend to forget an elderly lady who appeared interested only in tea and conversation. Miss Marple had found that extremely useful over the years. The favourite to win the competition was Eleanor Finch. A widow in her late 60s, Eleanor had won the Golden Spoon Award 3 times and was widely admired for her remarkable preserves. Few people had a bad word to say about her. She greeted everyone warmly, complimented competitors, offering advice freely. Yet Miss Marple noticed that not everyone returned the kindness, particularly Agnes Pritchard. Agnes operated the village bakery and had finished second to Eleanor twice in recent years. Though outwardly pleasant, she watched Eleanor with a tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. Nearby stood Margaret Bellamy, chairwoman of the fair committee. She seemed unusually nervous, despite the festive atmosphere. Several times she checked the entrance doors. Several times she glanced toward Eleanor, as though waiting for something or someone. Interesting, very interesting indeed. As afternoon turned to evening, judging began. The villagers gathered around the display tables. Conversations buzzed excitedly. Predictions circulated. Most expected Eleanor Finch to win yet again. When the judges announced the results, those predictions proved correct. Eleanor accepted the Golden Spoon Award to enthusiastic applause. She laughed modestly and thanked the crowd. The atmosphere was cheerful, almost perfect. Then came the tasting. As part of the celebration, small samples from the winning batch were served to attendees. Fresh bread was distributed. Eleanor's prize-winning strawberry preserve was spooned generously onto each piece. People sampled it happily. Among them was Arthur Penrose. Arthur was one of the village's wealthiest residents and a major sponsor of community events. Though respected, he was not especially loved. His sharp business dealings had created enemies over the years. Still, nobody expected trouble, least of all what happened next. Only minutes after eating the preserve, Arthur suddenly staggered. His face lost all color. The conversation around him stopped. A plate crashed to the floor. Arthur clutched at a nearby table. For a brief moment he appeared unable to breathe. Then he collapsed. Panic erupted instantly. Several villagers rushed forward. Someone called for a doctor. Others shouted for assistance. The cheerful celebration dissolved into confusion. Miss Marple remained seated, not from indifference, from observation. In moments of panic, people revealed things. The village doctor arrived quickly. Within minutes his expression became grim, very grim indeed. Arthur Penrose was dead. A stunned silence settled over the hall. Nobody seemed capable of understanding what had happened. Then the doctor's gaze shifted toward the half-empty tasting table, toward the slices of bread, toward the open jar of strawberry preserve. His expression darkened. "Nobody touched anything," he said firmly. The words sent a chill through the room. An even colder realization followed. If the doctor's suspicion proved correct, Arthur Penrose had not suffered a natural illness. He had been poisoned, and the poison appeared to have come from Eleanor Finch's award-winning jam. Shock spread through the gathering. People stared at Eleanor. The elderly widow looked utterly bewildered. "I don't understand," she whispered. Neither did anyone else. But as villagers exchanged frightened glances, Miss Marple found herself studying something entirely different. Not the jar, not the body, not even Eleanor Finch. Her attention rested upon Margaret Bellamy. For a fraction of a second after Arthur collapsed, before the panic began, Margaret had displayed a curious expression. Not surprising, not horror, something else, something far more troubling. Recognition, as though what had happened was dreadful, but not entirely unexpected, and that, Miss Marple suspected, might prove to be the first truly important clue. The death of Arthur Penrose transformed the harvest and preserves fair from a celebration into a scene of shock and suspicion. Within an hour, the village hall had been cleared, the tasting tables secured, and police officers had begun interviewing witnesses. No one in Ashcombe on Wold could remember anything remotely similar happening before. The village thrived on routine. Murder belonged in newspapers, not at local fairs. Yet the grim reality stood before them. Arthur Penrose was dead, and the most likely source of the poison appeared to be a jar of strawberry preserve entered by Eleanor Finch. By the following morning, gossip had spread throughout the village. Every shop, garden gate, and tea table buzzed with speculation. Many residents reached the same conclusion almost immediately. Eleanor Finch must somehow be responsible. After all, the poison had apparently been found in her prize-winning preserve. The logic seemed simple, too simple, Miss Marple thought. Inspector Gerald Harper arrived from the county headquarters and quickly took charge of the investigation. Initial tests suggested that a toxic substance had indeed been mixed into the contents of the jam jar used during the tasting. The discovery only increased suspicion toward Eleanor. She remained calm during questioning, but seemed genuinely distressed. "I would never harm anyone," she told the inspector. "Did you prepare to preserve yourself?" he asked. "Of course. Did anyone have access to it afterward?" "Voici ton fa." Eleanor hesitated. The pause immediately caught Harper's attention. "Yes," she admitted. "Who?" The entries were stored overnight in the village hall before judging. "Unattended?" "No. Committee members had access." "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." That answer widened the field considerably. Several people could potentially have handled the preserve before the competition. Meanwhile, Miss Marple quietly listened to conversations around the village. One detail continued to trouble her. Arthur Penrose had not been universally liked. In fact, a surprising number of people seemed relieved rather than saddened by his death. Not openly, of course, but human nature often reveals itself in subtle ways. At the post office, two women discussed Arthur's business practices. At the bakery, another resident mentioned long-standing disputes involving land ownership. Even the village butcher recalled a bitter disagreement that had lasted years. Enemies, it seemed, were not difficult to find. That afternoon, another important fact emerged. Several witnesses remembered Arthur refusing a sample from another preserve stall shortly before tasting Eleanor's jam. The refusal itself meant little. The reason was more interesting. According to one witness, Arthur had been arguing with someone moments earlier. Who was he arguing with? Inspector Harper asked. The witness frowned thoughtfully. "I couldn't hear much. But you saw the person?" "Yes. Who was it?" "Margaret Bellamy. The committee chairwoman, the same woman whose expression had caught Miss Marple's attention after Arthur's collapse." Inspector Harper immediately arranged an interview. Margaret appeared cooperative but nervous. "Did you argue with Arthur Penrose?" he asked. "A minor disagreement. About what? Fair finances." The answer seemed oddly specific. Fair finances. He believed certain committee expenses were excessive. Was the argument serious? "No. yet her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. The inspector noticed. So did Miss Marple when she later heard the account. People often lied with words. Their hands were usually less disciplined. The following morning, a further complication arose. Laboratory analysis revealed something unexpected. Only one portion of the strawberry preserve contained poison. The rest of the jar appeared perfectly normal. The findings stunned investigators. If Eleanor had intended murder, poisoning a single spoonful made little sense. The discovery suggested something far more deliberate. Someone had targeted a specific victim. Someone had wanted Arthur Penrose and nobody else. When Inspector Harper shared the results with Miss Marple, she nodded thoughtfully. "That seems significant," he said. "Extremely. You have an idea. Only an observation." "What observation?" Miss Marple adjusted her knitting. "People who poison entire jars often wish to create fear." "Yes. People who poison a single serving usually wish to create certainty." The inspector frowned. Certainty that a particular person will die. The distinction lingered in his thoughts long after the conversation ended. As evening settled over Ashcombe on Wold, suspicion continued shifting from one villager to another. Eleanor Finch remained under scrutiny. Margaret Bellamy's argument with Arthur raised troubling question. Old business disputes resurfaced. Long-forgotten grievances emerged. Yet Miss Marple felt increasingly certain of one thing. The poisoned jam jar was not the true mystery. It was merely the method. The real mystery lay elsewhere, in the relationships hidden beneath years of village politeness, in secrets that existed long before the harvest fair, and in whatever had caused Margaret Bellamy to look not surprised when Arthur Penrose collapsed, but frightened in the peculiar way people often became when a danger they had long expected finally arrived. 3 days after Arthur Penrose's death, Ashcombe on Wold had settled into an uneasy routine. Shops opened, gardens were tended, and church bells continued to ring on schedule. Yet beneath the familiar rhythms lay a growing sense of distrust. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else. The investigation dominated every conversation. Inspector Harper had interviewed nearly every resident connected to the harvest fair, but progress remained frustratingly slow. No clear suspect had emerged. Too many people possessed motives. Too many opportunities existed, and the poison serving remained a puzzle. If only Arthur had been targeted, someone must have known exactly which sample he would eat. That required planning, careful planning. Miss Marple spent her mornings taking gentle walks through the village, appearing to do little more than enjoy the countryside. In reality, she listened carefully. People often reveal the truth indirectly, not through confessions, through complaints, through gossip, through small contradictions. One such contradiction appeared during a conversation with Mrs. Evelyn Carter, who managed the village library. Arthur Penrose, she explained, had recently become interested in old local records. He spent quite a bit of time here during the last few months. "Researching what?" asked Miss Marple. "I am not entirely sure. Family history." "No." Mrs. Carter lowered her voice. "He was asking questions about property transfers and village land agreements." "Oh." Miss Marple paused. "Recent agreements?" "Oh no, very old ones." "How old?" 20 years, perhaps longer. The information lodged itself firmly in her mind. Later that afternoon, she visited the library herself. The records were not particularly exciting, at least not at first glance. Most consisted of legal notices, council documents, and property maps. Yet one folder appeared unusually thin. A notation on the cover suggested several documents should have been present. They were not. Miss Marple mentioned this to Mrs. Carter. The librarian looked surprised. "How odd. They are missing." "It seems so. When were they last seen?" "I couldn't say." "Missing documents. Old land agreements. Arthur Penrose conducted research shortly before his death." "Interesting. Very interesting. Indeed." Meanwhile, Inspector Harper received information of his own. A local solicitor named Henry Abbott reported an unusual meeting that had occurred roughly 2 weeks before the murder. Arthur Penrose had visited his office seeking advice. According to Abbott, Arthur appeared deeply troubled. He seemed nervous, the solicitor explained. Did he say why? No, but he kept asking questions about legal liability. Liability for what? Actions committed years ago. The inspector's interest sharpened immediately. What sort of actions? He never specified. The conversation suggested Arthur had been worried about something from the past, something serious enough to seek legal guidance. Yet he had told nobody else, at least nobody is willing to admit it. That evening, another piece of information surfaced. Agnes Pritchard, the baker who had long competed against Eleanor Finch, came forward voluntarily. She appeared reluctant, almost embarrassed. "I thought you should know," she told Inspector Harper. "Know what?" "I saw Arthur and Margaret Bellamy together the night before the fair." The inspector leaned forward. "Where?" "Outside the village hall." "Were they arguing?" "Yes." "What?" "About." "I couldn't hear everything." "What did you hear?" Agnes hesitated. Then she spoke carefully. Arthur said, "You should have told me years ago." The room fell silent. "Are you certain?" "Quite certain." And Margaret's response? "It is too late now." The statement carried an unsettling weight. Too late for what? The inspector immediately arranged another interview with Margaret. This time, she appeared visibly distressed. When confronted with Agnes's account, she admitted the conversation had occurred, but she refused to explain it. "It was personal." "Personal? In what way?" "I'd rather not say." "You understand. A man is dead." "I know." "Then help me understand." Margaret's eyes filled briefly with emotion, yet she remained stubbornly silent. The refusal only deepened suspicion. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat near a window with her knitting while reflecting on everything she had learned. The poison itself remained important. Certainly, but she increasingly believed the answer lay elsewhere. People kept pointing backward. Old land agreements, missing documents, legal concerns, conversations about things that should have been revealed years ago. The murder seemed less like an isolated crime and more like the final chapter of a much older story. As darkness settled over the village, another discovery quietly emerged. During a search of Arthur Penrose's study, investigators found a notebook hidden inside a locked desk drawer. Most of its pages contained ordinary business matters. One page, however, held a single handwritten sentence. Nothing more, no explanation, no names. Just 6 words that immediately captured Inspector Harper's attention. "I finally know what happened." And beneath those words appeared a date, written only 4 days before Arthur Penrose died. The discovery of Arthur Penrose's notebook sent a ripple through the investigation. Until then, Inspector Harper had been working with fragments of suspicion and scattered motives. Now there was evidence that Arthur had uncovered something shortly before his death. The question was what, and perhaps more importantly, whom it threatened. The single sentence found in the notebook occupied Harper's thoughts constantly. "I finally know what happened." It suggested a mystery that predated the murder, a secret Arthur had only recently solved. If the secret was dangerous enough, it might also explain why someone wanted him silenced. Over the next few days, the inspector focused increasingly on Arthur's activities during the weeks before the harvest fair. A pattern gradually emerged. Arthur had spoken with several people connected to village affairs from many years earlier: former council members, retired solicitors, residents who had lived in Ashcombe on Wold for decades. Individually, the meetings seemed harmless. Taken together, they suggested deliberate research. Miss Marple listened carefully when Harper shared these findings. "You believe he was investigating something?" she asked. "I'm certain of it." "Then perhaps the important question is not what he discovered." The inspector looked puzzled. "What is the important question? Why did he begin looking in the first place?" Harper considered this. It was a sensible observation. People rarely start digging into old secrets. Without a reason, something must have prompted Arthur's interest. The following morning, a breakthrough appeared to arrive unexpectedly. While sorting through archived village records, Mrs. Carter discovered a faded newspaper clipping tucked inside an old file. The article was more than 20 years old. Its headline concerned a proposed housing development on the edge of the village. The project had generated considerable controversy at the time. Several residents had opposed it, others had supported it. Eventually, the development was abandoned. Ordinarily, such an article would have attracted little attention. What mattered were the names mentioned within it: Arthur Penrose, Margaret Bellamy, and Eleanor Finch's late husband, Robert Finch. All three had been involved in committee discussions surrounding the project. Several other familiar village names appeared as well. Miss Marple examined the clipping with interest. History, she knew, had a habit of lingering long after people believed it forgotten. That same afternoon, Inspector Harper made another visit to Margaret Bellamy. This interview proved more revealing than previous attempts. Margaret looked exhausted. The strain of recent events was clearly affecting her. When shown the newspaper clipping, she immediately recognized it. "I remember that project. You served on the committee?" Harper asked. "Yes." "Was there disagreement?" "Plenty." "What sort of disagreement?" Margaret hesitated. Then she sighed. "Money. War." The answer came so quickly that Harper sensed the truth behind it. "What about money?" Some residents believed funds connected to the development weren't being handled properly. "Was there evidence?" "No, but people suspected." "Yes." The inspector leaned forward. "Who was suspected?" Margaret's expression tightened. "I'd rather not say." Yet once again, her refusal seemed less like protection of herself and more like protection of someone else. When Harper left, he carried more questions than answers. Meanwhile, another villager unexpectedly entered the picture. Thomas Grayson, a retired surveyor, approached police voluntarily. He claimed Arthur Penrose had visited him approximately 10 days before his death. According to Grayson, Arthur had been asking questions about property boundaries connected to the abandoned development. He wanted old maps. "Did he explain why?" Harper asked. "No, but he seemed convinced something was wrong." "Wrong in what way?" He thought records had been altered. The statement landed heavily. Altered records, missing documents, disputes about money, a hidden secret stretching back decades. The pieces were beginning to form a shape, though the complete picture remained elusive. That evening, Miss Marple sat in the garden of her friend's cottage, watching the sun descend beyond the hedgerows. Her knitting rested quietly in her lap. The village around her appeared peaceful. Children played in distant fields. Smoke rose from chimneys. Birds settled into the trees. Yet beneath that calm surface, fear continued spreading. Not merely fear of a murderer, fear of exposure. Several people seemed nervous whenever the past was mentioned. Several others appeared anxious whenever Arthur's recent investigations came up in conversation. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was far more interesting than the poison itself. Poison was merely a method. People chose methods. Motives came first. As twilight deepened, another development arrived. Inspector Harper received laboratory confirmation regarding the poisoned serving. The toxic substance had not been mixed into the preserve during preparation. It was added afterward, sometime shortly before Arthur consumed it. The finding effectively eliminated Eleanor Finch as the most obvious suspect, but it also created a new and troubling reality. The killer had almost certainly been present inside the village hall during the harvest fair, watching, waiting, and knowing exactly when Arthur Penrose would reach for that particular piece of bread. The laboratory findings dramatically altered the course of the investigation. For days, suspicion had hovered over Eleanor Finch simply because the poisoned preserve bore her label. Now that theory was rapidly collapsing. The poison had been introduced shortly before Arthur Penrose ate the sample. Someone had tampered with the serving during the fair itself. Someone present in the hall. For Eleanor, the news brought relief, though only partial relief. Many villagers still regarded her with unease. Murder had a way of attaching itself to innocent people long after evidence cleared them. Eleanor endured the whispers with quiet dignity. Miss Marple admired that. In her experience, truly innocent people often behaved differently from those merely pretending to be innocent. Eleanor appeared saddened by the suspicion, not outraged by it. There was a distinction. Meanwhile, Inspector Harper turned his attention toward the movements of those present during the tasting. Unfortunately, dozens of villagers had been moving about the hall during the crucial period. The scene had been crowded, chaotic, perfect for someone wishing to act unnoticed. Several witnesses recalled seeing Margaret Bellamy near the refreshments table. Others remembered Agnes Pritchard moving between displays. Committee volunteers had carried trays. Judges had wandered through the crowd. The list of possibilities remained frustratingly long. Then, another curious detail emerged. One of the volunteers, a young schoolteacher named Lucy Warren, remembered seeing Arthur Penrose receive a handwritten note shortly before the tasting began. Inspector Harper questioned her immediately. "A note, yes. Who delivered it? I didn't see. What happened afterward? He read it and seemed upset. Did he keep it?" "I think so." The information generated immediate interest. If Arthur had received a message moments before his death, it might explain his actions that afternoon. Perhaps it had drawn him toward someone. Perhaps it had prompted a meeting. Perhaps it had revealed the secret he appeared to have uncovered. Unfortunately, no note was found among Arthur's belongings. If it existed, it had disappeared. That evening, Harper discussed the matter with Miss Marple. Somebody may have removed it after the murder. Quite possibly, Miss Marple agreed, which would suggest the note was important. Or embarrassing. The inspector smiled faintly. "You always complicate things. Human beings are complicated creatures, Inspector." The following day brought another revelation. A retired accountant named Samuel Briggs requested a private meeting with police. Briggs had once worked with several village committees, including those involved in the abandoned housing development years earlier. His memory, despite his age, remained excellent. "I've been thinking about Arthur Penrose," he said, "and he visited me recently." "What did he want?" He asked about financial records. "Inspector." Harper's attention sharpened immediately. "Which records?" "The development project." "What specifically?" Briggs frowned. He wanted to know whether money had gone missing. The room became very quiet. "Did it?" "Not officially, unofficially." The old accountant shifted uncomfortably. "There were rumors." "What sort of rumors?" "That certain figures didn't quite add up." "Was it investigated?" "Briefly." "And?" "The matter disappeared." The answer raised more questions than it resolved. Why? Had the matter disappeared? Who benefited from its disappearance? And what connection did it have to Arthur's murder? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village bakery. Agnes Pritchard greeted her politely, though her manner seemed strained. The bakery was nearly empty. Only the smell of fresh bread filled the room. During their conversation, Agnes made a remark that immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. "I never trusted Arthur Penrose." The statement arrived without prompting. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "he liked controlling people." "That is a serious accusation." "It is true. Did you know him well?" "Not especially." Agnes paused, then added quietly, "But my father did." Miss Marple looked up. The baker appeared surprised by her own admission, as though she had revealed more than intended. "What was your father's connection to Mr. Penrose?" Agnes hesitated. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she shook her head. "It doesn't matter." But Miss Marple suspected it mattered very much. That evening she reflected upon the growing collection of clues. Missing documents, old financial irregularities, secret meetings, a vanished note, long-forgotten grievances. The murder appeared increasingly rooted in events that had occurred decades earlier. Yet something continued to trouble her. People spoke of money, property records, disputes, but their emotions suggested something deeper. Fear was present, certainly. So was guilt. But there was another feeling beneath it all: betrayal. The kind of betrayal that lingered for years, the kind people never truly forgot. And, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she found herself wondering whether Arthur Penrose had died because he discovered a financial secret, or because he finally uncovered who had betrayed whom all those years ago. A week had passed since Arthur Penrose's death, yet Ashcombe-on-Wold seemed no closer to regaining its peace. The investigation had become the village's constant preoccupation. Curtains twitched whenever police officers passed. Conversations stopped abruptly when strangers approached. Old friendships appeared strained, while long-buried resentments quietly resurfaced. Inspector Harper felt as though he were walking through layers of history, rather than investigating a modern crime. Every clue seemed to lead backward. The abandoned housing development remained at the center of those clues. Arthur's recent inquiries had revolved around it. The missing documents were connected to it. The financial irregularities mentioned by Samuel Briggs appeared tied to it as well. Yet nobody seemed willing to reveal the full story. When Harper returned to Briggs for further questioning, the retired accountant appeared increasingly uncomfortable. "You said there were rumors about missing money." "Yes, who started those rumors?" Briggs hesitated. "I don't remember." The answer was unconvincing. "I think you do." The old man sighed heavily. "Perhaps. Then tell me." For a long moment Briggs stared at the floor. Finally he spoke. "A man named Edward Langley." Harper immediately recognized the name. Edward Langley had once been a prominent businessman in the village. Though retired now and living quietly on the outskirts of Ashcombe-on-Wold, he had wielded considerable influence during the period in question. What did Langley claim? He believed funds connected to the development had been diverted. Did he have proof? No. Then why did people listen? Because he wasn't the only one asking questions. The inspector leaned forward. Who else? Arthur Penrose. The revelation was significant. 20 years earlier, Arthur himself had apparently been involved in concerns regarding the development, yet somehow those concerns had vanished. No investigation had followed. No scandal had emerged. Everything had simply faded away, or been made to fade away. Later that afternoon, Harper paid a visit to Edward Langley. The elderly businessman received him politely, but without enthusiasm, when asked about the development project. Langley gave a humorless smile. "I wondered how long it would take before someone came asking. You expected questions. I expected them years ago." The statement immediately caught Harper's attention. What happened back then? Nothing. Kawe, nati. And that is precisely the problem. Langley rose slowly from his chair and crossed to a nearby bookshelf. From a drawer, he produced a worn folder. "I kept copies." Copies of what? Correspondence. The folder contained letters exchanged between committee members involved in the development. Most appeared ordinary. One, however, stood out. It referenced concerns regarding accounting discrepancies. Another mentioned pressure to avoid public discussion. Neither letter directly accused anyone of wrongdoing, yet together they suggested that certain individuals had been eager to prevent further scrutiny. "Who wanted the matter dropped?" Harper asked. Langley shook his head. "I never knew, but someone succeeded." Yes, the answer lingered in the room like a shadow. Meanwhile, Miss Marple continued her own quiet observations. She spent an afternoon visiting several residents who had lived in the village during the controversy. Most offered little beyond vague recollections. One conversation, however, proved especially interesting. Mrs. Dorothy Hale, a retired schoolmistress, remembered something others had forgotten. There was a friendship. A friendship, asked Miss Marple, between Arthur Penrose and Margaret Bellamy. Miss Marple looked surprised. The two appeared distant now, almost uncomfortable around one another. Close friends? Very close. How long ago? 20 years, perhaps more. What happened? Mrs. Hale shrugged. They stopped speaking. Number. Reason? Not one person understood. Miss Marple thanked her and left with much to consider. Broken friendships often concealed important truths, especially when neither party wished to discuss the cause. That evening, another development arrived unexpectedly. During a search of committee storage boxes recovered from the village hall, police discovered an envelope hidden inside an old ledger. The envelope contained a photograph. Time had faded the image, but the faces remained recognizable. Arthur Penrose, Margaret Bellamy, Edward Langley, several other committee members, all standing together during the housing development project. At first glance, the photograph seemed unremarkable. Then Harper noticed something curious. One face had been scratched repeatedly with a sharp object, deliberately damaged, deliberately erased. The inspector examined the photograph carefully. The identity of the scratched-out figure could still be partially determined. A name appeared faintly. On the reverse side, only a few letters remained legible, yet they were enough to raise an entirely new question. Because the damaged figure was not Arthur, not Margaret, not Edward Langley. It was someone whose name had scarcely appeared during the investigation at all, someone connected to the development, someone who seemed to have vanished from village memory, and someone Arthur Penrose may have been trying desperately to find before he died. The discovery of the damaged photograph introduced an entirely new direction to the investigation. Until now, Inspector Harper had been pursuing financial irregularities, missing records, and long-forgotten disputes. Suddenly, there was another mystery. Who was the person erased from the photograph, and why had someone gone to such lengths to remove them from memory? The partial name written on the back of the photograph provided only limited help. Most of the ink had faded over the years. Only a by C. Surname remained reasonably clear, Whitaker. Beyond that, nothing was certain. Harper began searching through old village records. The effort produced frustratingly little. No current resident bore the name. No recent property owner matched it either. It was as though the individual had disappeared entirely from Ashcombe-on-Wold. Yet Miss Marple doubted people vanished so completely, without reason. People left traces, memories, stories, resentments. All one needed was someone willing to talk. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. At the church charity luncheon, Miss Marple found herself seated beside Mrs. Edith Barnes, one of the oldest residents in the village. Mrs. Barnes possessed an excellent memory and a fondness for conversation. Before long, the name Whitaker arose naturally. To Miss Marple's satisfaction, recognition immediately appeared in the elderly woman's eyes. "David Whitaker," she said. "Do you remember him?" Miss Marple asked. "Of course. What was he like?" Gander. Mrs. Barnes considered the question carefully. Ambitious? Anything else? He asked too many questions. The answer intrigued Miss Marple. What sort of questions? "Oh, all kinds." Mrs. Barnes lowered her voice. "He never accepted things at face value." The description sounded familiar, very familiar indeed. It reminded Miss Marple of Arthur Penrose's recent behavior. Always asking, always investigating, always searching. "What happened to Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. The old woman sighed. "He left. Why? No one really knew." Yet her tone suggested she suspected otherwise. After further gentle questioning, another detail emerged. David Whitaker had served on the Housing Development Committee decades earlier, just like Arthur, just like Margaret Bellamy, just like Edward Langley. The connection immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Meanwhile, Inspector Harper made progress of his own. His search uncovered correspondence indicating that Whitaker had abruptly resigned from several village organizations before leaving Ashcombe-on-Wold. The resignations occurred shortly after the controversy surrounding the development project. The timing seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Even more interesting, One letter contained a brief handwritten note. The message was short, almost cryptic. "I cannot remain where truth is unwelcome." Harper read the sentence several times. It suggested conflict, disappointment, perhaps even betrayal. The word truth appeared repeatedly. Throughout the investigation, Arthur had apparently been searching for it. Whittaker had seemingly left because of it, and someone had murdered to keep it hidden. That evening, Harper visited Margaret Bellamy once again. By now she looked exhausted from weeks of questioning. When shown a copy of Whittaker's resignation note, her reaction was immediate. Color drained from her face. For several seconds she stared silently at the paper. "You knew him well," Harper said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes, what happened?" "I don't know." The answer arrived too quickly, too automatically. The inspector remained silent. Eventually she looked away. He believed terrible things. What things? He thought people had lied to him. Had they? Margaret's eyes filled with emotion, but once again, she refused to answer directly. The interview ended with more questions than answers. Later that night, Miss Marple sat beside a small fire, reflecting upon everything she had learned. The pattern was becoming clearer. David Whittaker had not simply disappeared. He had left after losing faith in people he once trusted. Arthur Penrose, decades later, appeared to have discovered whatever caused that rupture, and shortly afterward, Arthur was dead. The connection felt increasingly impossible to ignore. The following morning, another significant development occurred. A former village clerk named Leonard Price came forward after hearing discussion of Whittaker's name. His memory proved remarkably useful. "David Whittaker didn't leave willingly," he said. "What do you mean?" Harper asked. "He intended to stay." "Are you certain?" "Quite certain." "Then why did he go?" Price hesitated. Then he delivered a statement that altered the entire investigation. "Because someone accused him." "Accused him of what?" The old clerk's expression darkened. "Stealing money from the development project." Silence filled the room. "The accusation fits perfectly with everything uncovered so far. Financial discrepancies, missing records, broken friendships, a vanished committee member. Yet something about it felt wrong. Because, according to Leonard Price, the accusation had destroyed Whittaker's reputation almost overnight. And years later, despite all the rumors and investigations, nobody had ever produced proof that he was actually guilty, which raised a troubling possibility. If David Whittaker had been innocent, then someone else had benefited from his disgrace, and perhaps Arthur Penrose had finally discovered exactly who that person was. The revelation that David Whittaker might have been falsely accused sent shockwaves through the investigation. For the first time, Inspector Harper could see a possible explanation connecting the events of the past with Arthur Penrose's murder. If Whittaker had been made a scapegoat decades earlier, then the true culprit behind the financial discrepancies may have remained hidden all these years. And if Arthur had recently uncovered that truth, his death suddenly became much easier to understand. The challenge, however, was proving it. Most of the individuals involved in the housing development controversy were elderly now. Memories had faded, documents had disappeared, witnesses had either moved away or died. Yet Miss Marple knew that people often remembered emotions long after they forgot facts. The key was finding someone who still carried the emotional scars of what had happened. That person turned out to be Margaret Bellamy. For weeks, she had resisted every attempt to discuss the past. Now the pressure appeared to be taking its toll. When Miss Marple visited her cottage one rainy afternoon, Margaret seemed tired and defeated. The older woman stared silently at the garden outside before finally speaking. "I suppose it was bound to come out eventually." Miss Marple waited patiently. Margaret gave a weary smile. "You have a talent for making people tell the truth." "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "people usually tell themselves the truth long before they tell anyone else." For several moments neither woman spoke. Then Margaret began. 22 years earlier, the development project had divided the village. Large sums of money had been involved. Contracts, land purchases, investments. Everyone expected prosperity. Instead, accusations emerged. David Whittaker became convinced something improper was occurring. He wouldn't let it go, Margaret said quietly. He kept asking questions. What sort of questions? About money. Did he find anything? Margaret lowered her eyes. I don't know. The answer carried uncertainty rather than deception. She genuinely seemed unsure. What happened then? Someone accused him of theft. Margaret nodded. The accusation spread rapidly. Within weeks, Whittaker's reputation had collapsed. Many former friends abandoned him. Several committee members publicly distanced themselves. Soon afterward he left Ashcombe-on-Wold, and Arthur, Miss Marple asked. Margaret's expression darkened. Arthur never believed David was guilty. The statement surprised Miss Marple. If that is true, why didn't he defend him? Margaret looked away. That is a question Arthur spent 20 years asking himself. The words lingered heavily between them. That evening Miss Marple shared the conversation with Inspector Harper. The inspector listened carefully. If Arthur believed Whittaker was innocent, he said, then perhaps his recent investigation was an attempt to correct an old mistake. Quite possibly. Which means he may have been reopening a scandal someone desperately wanted buried. Miss Marple nodded. The theory made increasing sense. The next breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. Harper received information from a regional records office regarding David Whittaker. To everyone's surprise, he was still alive. He had spent the past 2 decades living in another county under modest circumstances. The discovery created immediate excitement. At last, there was someone who might explain what had happened. Arrangements were made to interview him. 2 days later, Harper and Miss Marple traveled together to meet the man. David Whittaker was older now, his hair completely white, but his mind remained sharp. When informed of Arthur Penrose's death, genuine sadness crossed his face. Arthur's dead? I am afraid so, Harper said. Whittaker sat quietly for a long moment. Then he shook his head. He was trying to make things right. The statement immediately captured their attention. What do you mean? Harper asked. Whittaker sighed. A few months ago he contacted me. Recently. Yes. What did he want? Forgiveness. The room fell silent. Arthur had reached out shortly before his death. Not for information, not for evidence, for forgiveness. Whittaker explained that Arthur had admitted carrying guilt for many years. He believed he had failed a friend when it mattered most. He said he finally understood what happened, Whittaker said. The exact phrase sent a chill through Harper. It matched the note found in Arthur's notebook. I finally know what happened. Arthur's investigation had not merely uncovered financial wrongdoing. It had uncovered a betrayal that haunted him for decades. As the interview concluded, Harper asked one final question. Did Arthur tell you who he believed was responsible? Whittaker hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in his expression. No, nothing at all. He mentioned one thing. What was it? Whittaker frowned as he searched his memory. Then he slowly repeated the words. He said the answer wasn't hidden in the missing records. Harper leaned forward. Where was it hidden? Whittaker's gaze hardened. In the person who benefited most, when everyone stopped asking questions. The journey back to Ashcombe-on-Wold was quieter than usual. Inspector Harper spent much of it staring through the window, replaying David Whittaker's words in his mind. The answer wasn't hidden in the missing records. It was hidden in the person who benefited most when everyone stopped asking questions. The statement shifted the entire investigation. For weeks, Harper had focused on documents, financial discrepancies, and lost evidence. Now he found himself considering a simpler possibility. Follow the benefit. Who gained the most when Whittaker was discredited? Who gained the most when the controversy vanished? And who stood to lose everything if Arthur Penrose exposed the truth? Now, upon returning to the village, Harper began reviewing old committee records with renewed determination. The names were familiar by now. Arthur Penrose, Margaret Bellamy, Edward Langley, David Whittaker, several others. Most had gained little from the abandoned development. One name, however, stood apart. Edward Langley, the retired businessman, had acquired several parcels of land in the years following the project's collapse. At the time, the purchases attracted little attention, yet viewed from a broader perspective, the transactions appeared remarkably advantageous. Property values later increased substantially. What had seemed modest acquisitions eventually became highly profitable investments. Harper arranged another meeting with Langley. The elderly businessman received him calmly, almost too calmly. "You've come back, yes. You think I killed Arthur Penrose. I haven't said that. But you've considered it." Langley gave a faint smile. The inspector studied him carefully. "Did you benefit from the development project failing?" The businessman considered the question. "Financially, yes. Significantly, very." The honesty surprised Harper. "Then why admit it? Because it isn't a crime?" "No, but it does make me look suspicious." The answer was impossible to argue with. Langley acknowledged every uncomfortable fact without resistance, yet something about him still felt incomplete, as though he knew more than he was willing to reveal. Meanwhile, Miss Marple continued pursuing a different line of inquiry. She had become increasingly interested in Arthur Penrose himself. Everyone assumed Arthur had uncovered the truth shortly before his death. But what exactly had he discovered? More importantly, how had he discovered it? That question led her back to Arthur's house. With permission from his family, she spent several hours examining books, papers, and correspondence. Most proved unremarkable. Then she noticed something curious. Tucked inside a history volume was a folded piece of paper covered with names, several names, each crossed out one by one. Committee members, former officials, residents connected to the development. Only one remained, uncrossed: Edward Langley. At first glance, the finding appeared highly incriminating, yet Miss Marple frowned. Rather than celebrated, something felt wrong, very wrong indeed. If Arthur truly believed Langley was responsible, why continue investigating afterward? Why seek forgiveness from David Whittaker only days before his death? No, Arthur had been narrowing possibilities, not reaching conclusions. There was a difference. That evening, another important development emerged. Margaret Bellamy requested to speak privately with Inspector Harper. When she arrived, she appeared deeply troubled. For several moments, she struggled to begin. Finally, she spoke. "There is something I never told you." Harper waited. Arthur wasn't the only person investigating the past. The statement immediately caught his attention. Who else was? Margaret swallowed nervously. "I was." The confession altered everything. For weeks, Margaret had appeared frightened, evasive, and burdened by secrets. Now the reason became clearer. She had not merely been hiding information. She had been searching for answers herself. "What were you investigating?" Harper asked. "The accusation against David Whittaker, and," Margaret closed her eyes briefly, "I discovered evidence suggesting he was innocent." The room fell silent. "Evidence from where?" "Old correspondence." "Why didn't you come forward?" Her expression was filled with regret. "Because by then Arthur was already dead." The answer carried genuine sorrow. Not fear, not calculation, sorrow. For the first time, Harper began to suspect Margaret had spent years carrying her own burden of guilt. Before leaving, she revealed one final detail, a detail that immediately sent the investigation in an unexpected direction. Among the letters she discovered was a reference to a meeting held the night before Whittaker was publicly accused. Several committee members attended. Arthur Penrose had not been present. Neither had Edward Langley. Only 3 names appeared: Margaret Bellamy, Robert Finch, and an individual whose name had barely surfaced during the Sentee investigation, a committee treasurer named Harold Mercer. The significance struck Harper immediately. Harold Mercer had died years ago. which meant one of the few people who might have known the full truth was beyond questioning. Yet as Harper reviewed the information later that night, another realization slowly emerged. The dead treasurer was not the most interesting part of Margaret's discovery. The most interesting part was that someone had carefully ensured Harold Mercer's name remained absent from nearly every surviving record, as though a person connected to him had spent years making certain nobody looked too closely in that particular direction. By the time Inspector Harper gathered the principal figures of the investigation inside the village hall, Ashcombe-on-Wold had spent nearly 3 weeks living under the shadow of murder. The same hall that had hosted the Harvest and Preserves Fair now carried a very different atmosphere. The tables had been rearranged. The cheerful decorations were gone. The mood was tense and uncertain. Margaret Bellamy sat quietly near the front. Eleanor Finch appeared anxious but composed. Edward Langley waited with folded arms. Several other residents occupied nearby chairs, all eager to learn how Arthur Penrose had died and why. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the side of the room. As always, she appeared more interested in her knitting than the gathering itself. Inspector Harper began by reviewing the known facts. Arthur Penrose had been poisoned during the fair. The poison had been added shortly before he consumed the preserve. The murder was carefully planned and directed at a specific victim. Most importantly, Arthur had recently uncovered a truth connected to events that occurred more than 20 years earlier. The inspector then turned toward Margaret Bellamy. "You told us about Harold Mercer." She nodded. The room grew quiet. Harper continued. "For years everyone focused on David Whittaker because he was accused," Margaret said softly. "Yes, but he wasn't guilty." "No." The inspector allowed the statement to settle over the audience. David Whittaker had been innocent. All along, his disgrace had been built upon a lie that benefited someone else. Harper then explained what investigators had finally uncovered. Harold Mercer, the committee treasurer, had manipulated financial records during the housing development project. Small amounts of money had been diverted through transactions designed to appear legitimate. The scheme remained hidden until David Whittaker began asking questions. Whittaker came dangerously close to exposing the truth. At that point, someone needed a scapegoat. False accusations were spread. Evidence was distorted. Suspicion shifted toward Whittaker. His reputation collapsed. The investigation disappeared, and Harold Mercer escaped scrutiny entirely. A murmur spread through the room. The story finally made sense. The missing records, the financial discrepancies, the ruined friendship, the decades of silence. Yet one question remained. Harper looked toward the audience. Harold Mercer died years ago. The room fell silent. Again, if he was responsible, who murdered Arthur Penrose? At that moment, Miss Marple gently set down her knitting. Several people turned toward her. She spoke softly, yet every word carried clearly through the hall. Because Arthur discovered that the deception did not end with Harold Mercer. Nobody interrupted. He managed the money, certainly, but someone protected him. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a man seated near the rear of the room, a man who had attended nearly every stage of the investigation without attracting much attention. Daniel Mercer, Harold Mercer's son. His expression immediately changed, only slightly, but enough. Miss Marple continued. Arthur's investigations eventually led him to correspondence showing that Harold confessed the truth privately before his death. Daniel remained silent. The confession was never made public because his son obtained the documents. A faint tremor appeared in Daniel's hands. Arthur discovered those documents existed. He confronted Mr. Mercer shortly before the Harvest Fair and intended to reveal everything. The hall seemed to hold its breath. That is why Arthur received a note on the day of the fair. He was being lured into a final conversation. Inspector Harper stepped forward. The handwriting on the note matches samples obtained from Daniel Mercer. No denial came. Miss Marple continued gently. Arthur believed he could persuade you to tell the truth. Daniel laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. He should have minded his own business. The words echoed through the room. Several villagers gasped. For the first time, the mask slipped away completely. Daniel's face hardened. My father spent years being blamed for everything. He was guilty, Harper replied. Not alone. The anger in Daniel's voice was unmistakable. He protected other people, and they abandoned him. Miss Marple nodded sadly. Perhaps they did, but Arthur intended to correct that injustice. Daniel looked away. His silence became enough confession. Harper signaled to the officers waiting nearby. They moved forward quietly. Daniel offered no resistance. The struggle had left him long ago. As he was escorted from the hall, the villagers remained stunned, not because the mystery had been solved, because the solution had been hiding among them all along. In the weeks that followed, the truth about the old scandal became public. David Whittaker's name was finally cleared. Arthur Penrose's final efforts were recognized as an attempt to repair a terrible wrong. Long-buried records surfaced, and old wounds slowly began to heal. One afternoon, as life gradually returned to normal, Miss Marple sat in a garden overlooking the village. Children played in the distance. Church bells rang softly. The world appeared peaceful once more. Yet Miss Marple knew that appearances were often deceptive. Human nature rarely changes. People could live with guilt for decades. They could hide secrets, justify betrayals, and convince themselves that the past no longer mattered. But eventually, truth had a habit of returning, sometimes quietly, sometimes tragically, and in Ashcombe on Wold, it had arrived hidden within something as ordinary as a jar of strawberry jam.